Chapter 1. A Captive in Babylon's Royal Court. Verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, into Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with parts of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. With the directness characteristic of the sacred writers, Daniel enters at once upon his subject. He begins his book in a simple historical style. The first 6 chapters, with the exception of the prophecy of chapter 2, are narrative in content. With chapter 7, we reach the prophetical part of the book. Here, Siege of Jerusalem. Like one conscientious of uttering only well-known truths, he proceeds at once to state a variety of particulars by which his accuracy can be tested. The overthrow of Jerusalem recorded here was predicted by Jeremiah and was accomplished in 606 BC. Jeremiah 25, 8 through 11. Also note footnotes. The date 606 BC is widely supported by Usher, Hales, and other chronologicalists, but more recent research by archaeologists favors the date 605. This apparently more accurate date, however, in no way affects the calculation of prophetic periods presented by the author, for it should be remembered that the Jews and other ancients counted both the first and last years of a period. So on that footnote, Jeremiah places the captivity in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, Daniel the 3rd. This seeming discrepancy is explained by the fact that Nebuchadnezzar set out on his expedition near the close of the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, from which point Daniel reckons. But the king did not accomplish the subjection of Jerusalem until about the 9th month of the year following, from which year Jehoiakim reckons. Jehoiakim, though, bound for the purpose of being taken to Babylon, humbled himself and was permitted to remain as ruler in Jerusalem, tributary to the king of Babylon. This was the first time Jerusalem was taken by Nebuchadnezzar. Twice, subsequently, the city revolted, but it was recaptured by the same king and more severely dealt with each succeeding time. The second overthrow was during the time of Jehoiakim, son of Jehoiakim, when all the sacred vessels were either taken or destroyed, and the best of the inhabitants were led with the king into captivity. The third was under Zedekiah, when the city entered and endured a formidable siege. During its continuance for a year and a half, the inhabitants of the city suffered all the horrors of extreme famine, and at length the garrison and the king attempted to escape from the city, but they were captured by the Chaldeans. The sons of the king were slain before his face. Then his eyes were put out, and he was taken to Babylon. Thus was fulfilled the prediction of Ezekiel, that he should be carried to Babylon and die there, yet he should not see the place, in Ezekiel 12:13. The city and the temple were at this time utterly destroyed, and the entire population of the country, with the exception of a few husbandmen, were carried to captivity in Babylon in 586 BC. Such was God's passing testimony against sin. Not that the Chaldeans were the favorite of heaven, but that God made use of them to punish the iniquities of his people. Had the Israelites been faithful to God and kept his Sabbath, Jerusalem would have stood forever. It says this in Jeremiah 17:24 through 27. But they departed from him, and he abandoned them. They profaned the sacred vessels by bringing idols into the temple. Therefore God allowed these vessels to be further profaned by letting them go as trophies to heathen shrines abroad. The Hebrew captivities in Babylon. During these days of trouble and distress upon Jerusalem, Daniel and his companions were nourished and instructed in the palace of the king of Babylon. Though captives in a strange land, they were doubtless in the same respects much more favorably suited than they could have been in their native country. In here in verse 3 it says that the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and the king's seed and the princes, children in whom there was no blemish, but well favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge and understanding, science, and such as had an ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end of thereof they might stand before the king. And this runs through verse 5. Here is recorded the probable fulfillment of the judgments predicted by the prophet Isaiah to King Hezekiah more than 100 years before, when this king had vaingloriously shown to the messengers of the king of Babylon all the treasures and of the holy things of his palace and his kingdom. Hezekiah was told that all these good things would be carried as trophies to the city of Babylon, and that even his own children and his descendants would be taken away and be eunuchs in the palace of the king there. And this was told in 2 Kings 20:14 through 18. The word children, as applied to these captives, is not to be confined to the sense of which is limited at the present time. It included youth also. We learn from the record that these children were already skillful in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and had an ability in them to stand in the king's palace. In other words, they had acquired a good degree of education, and their physical and mental powers were so far developed that a skillful reader of human nature could form an accurate estimate of their capabilities. They are supposed to have been about 18 or 20 years of age. In the treatment which these Hebrew captivities received, we see an instance of the wise policy and the liberality of the rising king Nebuchadnezzar. Instead of choosing means for the gratification of low and base desires, as too many kings of later times have done, he chose young men to be educated in all matters pertaining to the kingdom, that he might have efficient help in administering to its affairs. He appointed them daily provision of his own food and drink. Instead of the coarse fare, which some might have thought good enough for captives, he offered them his own royal viands. For the space of 3 years they had all the advantage the kingdom afforded. Though captives, they were royal children, and they were treated as such by the humane king of the Chaldeans. In verse 6, it says, Now among those were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. In verse 7, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name Belshazzar, and Hananiah of Shadrach, and then to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Daniel and his companions being renamed. This change of names was probably made on account of the significance of the words. In Hebrew, Daniel signifies judge for God, Hananiah, gift of the Lord, Mishael, who is what God is, and Azariah, whom Jehovah helps. Since these names had reference to the true God and signified some connection with his worship, they were changed to names which had definitions linking them to the heathen divinities and worship of the Chaldeans. Thus, Belshazzar, the name given to Daniel, signified prince of Bel. Shadrach, servant of Sin, the moon god. Meshach, who is what Aku is, Aku being the Sumerian equivalent of Sin, the name of the moon god, and Abednego, servant of Nebo. In verse 8, the Bible says, But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the princes of the eunuch that he might not defile himself. And now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse likening than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenance be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them to this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine they should drink, and gave them pulse. The end of that section goes through verse 16. In this record, Nebuchadnezzar appears wonderfully free from bigotry. It seems that he took no means to compel his royal captive to change their religion. Provided they had some religion, he seemed satisfied, whether it was the religion he professed or not. And although their names had been changed to signify some connection with heathen worship, This may have been more to avoid the use of Jewish names by Chaldeans than to indicate any change of sentiment or practice on the part of whom the names were given. Daniel's diet. Daniel purposed not to defile himself with the king's food or with his wine. Daniel had other reasons for this course than simply the effect of such a diet upon his physical system, although he would derive great advantage in this respect from the fare he proposed to adopt. It was frequently the case the food used by the kings and princes of heathen nations, who were often the high priests of their religion, first offered and sacrificed to idols, and the wine they used poured out as a libation before their gods. Again, some of the flesh food used by the Chaldeans was pronounced unclean by the Jewish law. On either of these grounds, Daniel could not, consistently with his religion, partake of these articles. Hence, he respectfully requested the proper officer that from the conscientious scruples he might not be obliged to defile himself. The prince of the eunuchs feared to grant Daniel's request, since the king himself had appointed the food for Daniel and his companions. This shows the great personal interest the king took in these captives. It appears that his sincere object was to secure in them the best mental and physical development that could be attained. How different is this from the bigotry and tyranny which usually hold supreme control over the hearts of those who are clothed with absolute power. In the character of Nebuchadnezzar we shall find many things worthy of our highest admiration. It is interesting to note what was included in Daniel's request for his diet. The Hebrew word zerium here, translated pulse, is built on the same root as the word seed in the record of creation, where it mentions every herb seeding seed, and again the fruit of tree seeding seed in Genesis 1:29. This makes it clear that Daniel's request included grains, legumes, and fruits. And if we understand Genesis 9:3 correctly, the green herb itself must have been included in the diet requested. In other words, the menu for which Daniel asked for and which he received was made up of cereals, legumes, fruits, nuts, and vegetables. A vegetarian diet of good variety, together with the universal drink for man and beast, clear water. The Cambridge Bible has these notes on Zerum. Vegetable food in general. There is no reason for restricting the Hebrew word used to leguminous fruit such as beans and peas, which is what the term pulse properly denotes. Gesenius gives the definition: seed, herbs, greens, vegetables, vegetable food, such as what was eaten in a half-fast, as opposed to meats and more delicate kinds of food. A 10-day trial of this diet resulting favorably, Daniel and his companions were permitted to continue it during the whole course of their training for the duties of the palace. In verse 17 it says, "As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And now at the end of the days the king had said he should bring them in, that the princes of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with him, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding the king inquired of them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his own realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus." And verse 21 is where that ends. After 3 years' study, to Daniel alone seems to have been committed an understanding in visions and dreams. But the Lord's dealing with Daniel in this respect does not prove his companions any less accepted in his sight. By their perseveration in the midst of the fiery furnace, they had equally good evidence of the divine favor. Daniel probably had some natural qualifications that peculiarly fitted him for this special work. The same personal interest in these individuals herefore manifested by the king, he still continued to maintain. At the end of 3 years, he called them to a personal interview. He must know for himself how they had fared, and to what proficiency they had attained. This interview also shows the king to have been a man well versed in all the arts and science of the Chaldeans, else he would not be able to qualify to examine others. Recognizing merit wherever he saw it without respect to religion or nationality, he acknowledged them to be 10 times superior than any in his own land. And it is added that Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus.